Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics Football. It's Fran here, and today it's just going to be more of a open video, I think, to actually address the general Game Week 1 team selection. And what we've created here is something similar to what we did in Euro Fantasy, where we've created a sort of cheat sheet for members of the community to use. And this is kind of a basis for you guys to pick your own teams based on some of the advice that I might be giving this video, and then just based on a general kind of tier list structure, where I think you'll be better off with maybe going for one or two differentials, such as the orange colored players, and then going or basing your team largely around these kind of best choices slash good choices as well, depending on how you try to flex your budget around and kind of what formation you want to play and how you want to attack the first few weeks, whether you want to kind of position yourself for an early wild card, maybe game week 4, maybe game week 7 to attack those Chelsea fixtures, or if you want to play a safer approach and kind of go for a bit more of a long-term approach. But here, I think I've rated the players mostly around the early game weeks, their early fixtures, and the capacity for some players to do exceptionally better compared to last year, and also some players that we did well last year that we still think are priced well in the current year. So it's just starting off with the goalkeepers. It's relatively simple, right? I think everyone kind of has their eye on Sanchez at 4.5. This is due to two things. I think first of all, most people think that Brighton in general is a team that can do better, but I think that's actually a little bit of a myth. I think that comes more towards the offensive end. I wouldn't necessarily say Brighton is a team that have underperformed defensively. So I think the case with Sanchez is more so that, based on last year, based on his points earned, he is a good 4.5 kind of keeper. His ceiling isn't necessarily super high compared to some of the other potential keepers, and I'll describe some of the other options later. But if Brighton have a similar season to last year, Sanchez becomes a solid, stable 4.5 option where you can flex your budget elsewhere. And Bachmann coming from Watford is a bit more of that kind of wild card where he could have very good upside playing for a part of that Watford defense, which was one of the better defenses in the Championship, and they were recognized as being the best defense themselves. And he comes off a strong Euros as well, and I think he will continue that form over the course of the year. Whether the actual Watford defense will be able to kind of be up to the task of playing in the Premier League is a different question. So I think with Sanchez, he's a bit more of a known quantity, and maybe you want to play it safe there. With Meslier, he was actually the clear best kind of 5.0 goalkeeper that we have in this year's kind of potential team selection. And simply put, the stats were really favorable to him last year, and we saw with Leeds that they shored up their defense towards the back half of the season, had very good results as well at home. And Meslier was, subject to a lot of shots, even got a few penalty saves in there during the season, and a lot of his bonus points really came from the fact that he had a lot of saves coming through the games. And that's kind of different to like most premium keepers that people would look to, right? Because players like Schmeichel, Ederson, even Allison aren't subject to many shots per game. They don't get bonus points necessarily always, and then they just don't really have to kind of stretch themselves often in terms of getting saves. Whereas someone like Martinez, who's 5.5 this year, reflects the fact that Aston Villa do take in a lot of shots, but he saves a lot of them, and then he gets you points in that way, even if Aston Villa don't get a clean sheet, right? And that's the interesting thing with Meslier and Martinez. These are both keepers who have very great individual statistics as keepers and have done exceptionally well this year, or last year rather, and you would imagine that they can reproduce similar levels of performances. I would say Martinez probably less so. I would say Meslier probably has a better shot at doing so, and he has less selection percentage, so it's kind of interesting there. But I think still ultimately, with FPL, you kind of want to stick with the 4.5 keeper because it just gives you that much more potential upgrading your midfield and your attack, or even your defense. Moving on though, let's actually go and have a look at the defenders. For me, I think Tsimikas is by far the most interesting 4.0, but the other kind of tidbit to that is, I mean, first of all, you have a Liverpool left back who is very attacking, and we kind of discussed that in the Tsimikas video. You'll see that kind of up on the screen here in a card. But then, of course, you have the opportunity to go over two 4.0 defenders potentially to start the first 3-4 game weeks, right? Before that kind of Christmas international break-ish, and sorry, not Christmas break, but the international break. And that's a chance for Amartey to have a lot of games in there. He played in the Community Shield versus Man City and had a standout performance, in my opinion. And he actually was playing centre-back to cover some defensive injuries that Leicester had in the previous year. And for that reason, I think it makes a lot of sense to go into Amartey and Tsimikas to start the season, because you have that kind of access into two very good defenses, in my opinion, in the Liverpool one. One where you have an actual attacker at a fantastic price, and then one where you have just a pure out-and-out centre-back who's To be honest, if Fofana was rated at 4.5, then I can't see why Amarty wouldn't be rated at 4.0. And then Omo Bamidele kind of rounds this list out, where he's probably going to be a starting fullback for Norwich, and he's an interesting option in that sense. But ultimately, Norwich have some tough fixtures to start, so I would consider him to be a differential. If we move on to the 4.5 kind of price bracket for defenders, we're mostly saying that Ben White is probably the better 4.5 defender here. Simply put, he's an Arsenal defender that is actually nailed. I made the point that you could maybe look into Chambers early on in the season, but I still have seen Bellerin kind of pop in the preseason, and I'm a bit worried about whether Chambers is truly nailed. So for that reason, I think it's better to play it safe, go for Ben White, someone who will definitely start and will benefit. This was still ultimately the third best defense in the league last year, and I think the potential to do better defensively is there, because with Gabriel back maybe coming in a few weeks, Arsenal will have a much better defense than in my opinion, that they did last year. The only issue being kind of that right back flexibility and having a good solid right back. But ultimately, the same core of the team is there. Maybe Partey is injured, but to start the season, to have a 4.5 player who's a bit safe, can have a good fixture versus Brentford, I would say Ben White is definitely the one. And then with Ayling and Veltman, you have kind of pieces that are playing maybe centre-back or even full-back at times, really kind of filling the gaps for their teams. I wouldn't say that they necessarily get attacking returns, but they do play for teams that have consistently scored quite decently, I would say, for fantasy. Maybe Leeds defenders haven't done so much. I think really Dallas was the exception last year, whereas Ayling was kind of playing that role where he was covering multiple positions at times and ultimately didn't have many attacking forays. Veltman, much the same. And I think Veltman is kind of a stopgap to someone like Lamptey, who will be more interesting when he comes back into the side. But for now, I'm not too hot on these players. You might want to kind of pair them up with other 4.5 or other 4.0 players, because sometimes you could kind of look at the fixture list and see that maybe Ayling does quite well with Amarty, for example. But that's my opinion on that. In terms of the 5.0 defenders, this is where we start to get into the more quality kind of fullbacks or more consistent players, with the exception of Tsimikas, in my opinion, who could play, fullback for an elite attacking team. So Soufal is actually relatively underpriced, in my opinion, at 5.0. He was one of the lead chance creators in open play, I think the second in the league last year. And of course, he doesn't necessarily take as many set pieces as his counterpart in Cresswell, but we saw that he did relatively well over the course of the year, and I think has slowly grown, to be honest, as a player. And we saw that in the Euros as well, when he was quite instrumental in the Czech Republic performances. Then you have someone like Dunk at 5.0. Now, my only issue with Dunk really is the fact that most people will be going for Sanchez, so it doesn't really necessarily make sense to go with Dunk to open the season, especially when you have Soufal as another option. But ultimately, Dunk was a top defender last year, and he was someone who was a big aerial threat, someone that we kind of see maybe Maguire having a good season again. He would be cheaper than Maguire potentially, and if you need a kind of gap at that 5.0 spot, and maybe you're already invested in West Ham players, and maybe it makes sense to diversify and go for Dunk. With Tierney, you actually have the first kind of, I would say, kind of nailed fullback once again, with the exception of Tsimikas, playing for Arsenal. I wouldn't necessarily say he's a huge upgrade over Ben White, because one of the issues with Tierney is, first of all, he is a little bit injury prone, and then second of all, it probably makes sense to have a as cheap as you can get defense, in my opinion, this year, with how solid the 4.5 options are, or even the 4.0 options. And therefore, that's why I would kind of place him as just a good choice for now, because even though Tierney has fantastic crossing, there's just the option to go for Ben White if you want to secure those Arsenal clean sheet points. At 5.0, we then also have the two fullbacks for Aston Villa, and arguably three, right, with Ashley Young potentially being an option. Someone who could be playing out of position at midfield, but I see him more as a depth option right now. Someone who can rotate and play midfield and fullback, whereas I think Cash and Target are probably going to be the starting fullbacks based on the preseason games. Versus that game with Salernitana, I think Aston Villa were playing Cash and Target. Cash had an assist, and Target still had a relatively solid game. But in my opinion, I think Cash might have the potential to have a better season. We'll have to really wait and see what happens. It depends on how Aston Villa play, what kind of formation they try to play. But I did note that Dean Smith was really pushing Cash to kind of push forward and actually attack in the season. So we might see that these Aston Villa defenders, especially fullbacks, will be branching out a little bit more forwards and actually contributing a little bit more to the attack. Because both of them had only 2 assists last year, and we kind of relied on them for clean sheet points. But this year they could really take the step up depending on how Aston Villa expand their attacking play. But moving on, we have the 5.5 category, and this is where we have plenty of great defenders. And of course, I've listed Shaw as the best choice defender. We all know why, to be honest. He plays for a Man United side that have really upgraded their defense. He had a fantastic Euros run. Of course, there was the kind of worry about the injury, but it seems like he's fine because he was able to play versus Everton with no real issues, as far as I could tell. And I think he has a position to kind of take those left corners and very deep, maybe left-sided midfield crosses where he could really get those assists like he did in the Euros. And we saw that in the kind of Everton preseason game, right? And I mean, there's a lot of hype around the kind of Man United set piece coach, but I mean, he could benefit from that, right? I think Shaw actually got much less assists than we expected from the last season. And part of the reason why his points was low last year was a mix of, having to deal with the Tellers rotation and then also potentially playing some games without Maguire at the end of the last season. Whereas I think this year they could get off to a red hot start. The fixtures are nice for United and it makes sense to get Shaw only at a 5.5 price. Then I think, when you look at other Man United defenders, there's a clear priority where I think you go to Wan-Bissaka next, who he could be kind of unshackled a little bit by Sancho. He could play off Sancho. Sancho could get a double team on him, and Wan-Bissaka could be free to kind of go for crosses and look for other attacking options. He was a player who didn't actually have very high expected assists last year, but still managed to have a tremendous season in terms of how many assists he was able to get. But I would still prioritize him second to Shaw. And then you, of course, have Maguire, who will probably get a few headed goals last season. He hit the crossbar a couple of times last year. Didn't really attack, I think, the goal as much as people would have expected, or attack as well as people would have expected. But, if we base off the fact that Duncan's such a great kind of attacking season, we still see the potential for an attacking centre-back to do well, right? Someone who is such an aerial threat like Maguire. So I think I would still put him there. But probably I would be more tempted by Shaw and then Wan-Bissaka first. Outside of Man United, though, of course, we have other options such as Digne and Cresswell. And both of these are players who could take a few set pieces. I think Cresswell is much more nailed on set pieces for his West Ham side, whereas Digne is seemingly taking some set pieces and deferring in some spaces, potentially to someone like Demarai Gray. But we know in open play that Digne is a much better player, in my opinion, someone who can actually cross as long as someone is present, like DCL. Now, Digne is probably hampered by the fact that DCL could be injured for the first 2 game weeks. I'm not exactly sure what his injury condition is, but we're also a bit worried about that kind of 4-0 game versus Man United. What I will say, though, is that they are playing versus much nicer opponents. And simply put, I think Rafa Benitez is the type of manager to able to actually employ a defensive scheme quite early into a stint. I'm not sure if their attack will be flying to get out of the gates, but I think that they can shore up on the defense quite quickly. And we'll have to really see, based on that Southampton game, how good he is. But I would still be tempted to start him at game week 1, just because there's the historic kind of potential with him attacking so well last year. And it really just is a question of whether Benitez can get the defense in order for game week 1. With Cresswell, as I said, West Ham didn't really have a great defense last season, to be honest. But you can see Cresswell and Soufal both did tremendously as fantasy players because their attacking outputs were great. And they actually had a lot of bonus points too. I don't see much changing this year, to be honest, because Cresswell still seems to be on set pieces. And simply put, West Ham's attack is still really on form. They were great in the preseason, and to be honest, ended the season mostly off a good note, even though they weren't able to hold on to top 4. But it was a historic finish for them in recent years, and I think Moyes can kind of continue to take this team forwards even without Lingard. So I think he's a good option. With Rudiger, I would have to just kind of shout out still just how solid Chelsea's defense is, and he is one of the more nailed options. I think the issue with, Alonso, Chilwell, James, these kind of players is that they were involved in, European Cup duty. And there's just the issue of rotation and kind of getting things right on match day 1. I mean, you could potentially punt on one of the Chelsea fullbacks, but I think it is a bit of a risk on match day 1. Rudiger is that more safe option for that team. But I put Alonso there as a differential. What I would say about Chelsea is that they were tremendous versus the big sides last year. Not so much versus Arsenal. But still, there's a potential there, even though the fixtures are tough, that Rudiger gets off to a good start because that Chelsea defense is really well-oiled and really well-structured, and not much has changed since the previous season. With Pereira, I saw a bit more potential with him. I think he had a fantastic Community Shield game, and at the end of last season when he came back and returned from injury, I thought he was a bit poor, but he seems to have improved in terms of kind of getting his flow back into the game, and his ability to attack now almost as a right mid at times is evident in my opinion. And I think this could be the season where he kind of, kind of rises up again as a great fullback asset. But I think we would still give him a bit more time. At this point, with the kind of pricing he has, I think there are better options to start the game week off with, and we might be able to, in time, kind of move into Pereira, since we probably have one or two 5.5 defenders all in our teams. Going above 5.5, 6+ price, we're really talking about some Man City players, potentially some Chelsea players, and really Trent, because Robertson's injured. I think Trent is the clear best option. Diaz is still very interesting because he is that kind of nailed-on defender. And then Cancelo becomes that differential because Walker is probably going to be rested for game week 1. But ultimately, they're playing Spurs, right? And then you would be worried about the fact that in game week 2, maybe if Walker comes back, then just punting on Cancelo just on the Spurs game is a little bit of a risk. So I think Diaz is interesting, in my opinion. If you're confident about the Man City defense and someone who actually wants, who's going to be playing and is nailed on to start. So that's my opinion on Diaz. Could be kind of an option if you want to build a more value team. I think most people building 5-a-sides would have included Diaz in their team as an example. But if we move on to the midfielders. So the midfielders is an interesting kind of bracket, right? Where I think this is the year where you could start with a 3-5-2 or 3-4-3. Because there's so many nice options between that 6 to 6.5 range, and you want to make full use of that. At 4.5, these are mostly kind of players who will be playing 90 minutes in our opinions, but won't necessarily kind of find their way affecting the score sheet. I would say it's clearly Brownhill, Gilmore, and Basuma. I mean, pick one of these players as you like. Probably Brownhill, in my opinion, would be good to start. The fixtures aren't too bad, and maybe if you already have a few Brighton players, you don't really want to triple up with Basuma, right? At 5.5, I've actually added someone like Mbeumo into this list, and Demarai Gray and Smith Rowe are very interesting options. Demarai Gray is kind of a new option for Everton, who obviously plays right now due to the fact that Richarlison is probably going to be rested potentially in game week 1 or a sub option, right? Due to the fact that he played in the Olympics. And I think Demarai Gray could be an interesting attacking option when he's playing versus a rather poor Southampton defense. And Emil Smith Rowe, someone who, unless Arsenal are able to kind of bring in a big talismanic kind of 10, he probably gets to start most of the matches this season as long as he stays relatively injury free. Whereas Mbeumo is that kind of interesting option where, you're kind of putting a little bit of money into a player that you think can develop and have a great season. A lot of people are projecting Brentford to do poorly this season, and that's why there's a bit of a worry there with Mbeumo, right? He could be that kind of second striker though, so he is arguably like one of the cheaper out of position players in this kind of Brentford side, and I think he has a lot of upside in that sense because he's a very kind of a technical threat in my opinion, and his ability to run in behind as well is very interesting. So I think Mbeumo is one to kind of keep your eyes on, and Smith Rowe, he's a great kind of game week 1, but then moving on to that, I don't know if you necessarily see a lot of returns for him. He did do well in both Chelsea games, I think, last year, but arguably at the 5.5 range, you might want to just push yourself up there to get a kind of 6 million player or 6.5 million player, and we'll kind of look at them right now. At 6 million, I think you have fantastic options. I might not even say Sarr is a differential. He could be arguably a good choice because he is one of Watford's talismanic players and probably is their talismanic player. The only kind of concern is whether Watford are able to kind of really effectuate much in the Premier League. I think their strongest asset last year was their defense, and then when we're talking about attack, Sarr still wasn't ultimately one of the top performers, I think, across the championship as a result of the way Watford play. They have a lot of options, not necessarily key options such as Sarr, but I think when you're looking at the comparisons, we're talking about sides like West Ham and Leeds United, who scored 62 goals last season, both. So that kind of put them within the top 6-7 teams in terms of goal scoring, and that makes them very interesting options because I think both these players will be nailed on. Benrahma is someone who is going to be moving into a starting position this year, but had a fantastic preseason, and I really am high on Benrahma this year. I think he 100% passes the eye test. And even if you actually look at the kind of per 90 minute expected goals and expected assist statistics, he actually ranks higher than someone like Bowen, who we all see as a great fantasy option this year, right? And I think Benrahma might have the faith in Moyes right now. And if he gets to start the season with these kind of nice fixtures, I think he could get off to a hot start. The same can be said with Harrison, who of course doesn't perform as well on underlying statistics as someone like Rafinha. So that's for me the reason why I would only put Harrison as a good choice. It probably makes more sense to go with Rafinha if you're looking for a Leeds option or at least Bamford. And I wouldn't necessarily triple up on Leeds right now. I think that's a little bit crazy given the fact that they probably have some tougher fixtures. You also have to factor in, I know people like to make the argument that Leeds can score versus any side, but you also have to be a little bit logical with that kind of argument, right? I think Leeds were a side that were able to do very well at home last year, and I'm a bit worried about their kind of away form. So starting the season off away, I'm less tempted to go deep into Leeds to start the season. But I think you can position yourself with a team that has the capacity to move into Leeds players, and that would kind of put yourself in a safe position. So definitely Benrahma is the priority there. At 6.5, Rafinha is the clear and best option. I mean, his underlying statistics really should make him priced at least like a 7.5 midfielder, to be quite honest. I think there's a bit of perhaps subduedness, I think, due to of his price, maybe because people expect Leeds to have that kind of lag effect of, second season in the Premier League, whether you're able to kind of step up to the plate again. And I think Leeds really are able to. So I think he is at a fantastic price of 6.5. Just I think he doesn't have the best game week 1 fixture, and people might not be so tempted into kind of immediately starting with him. But he is really that kind of player who is almost set and forget right now, that kind of territory. And I think Rafinha is the best at that price point. The next two players I think are quite interesting because once again they come from one of the better attacking teams in the previous season in terms of Aston Villa and West Ham. Bowen, as we discussed, is going to be that kind of right wing option who might have to deal with a little bit with rotation with Yarmolenko now, but I think is seen as one of Moyes' more preferred players and someone he trusts to play several kind of roles on the pitch. And we saw Bowen have a relatively strong injury-free season last year, and I think he's the type of player who can probably take another step up in terms of production this year. So he's a very interesting option there. With Buendia, you have a player who probably fills into that kind of creative role that Grealish has left. You could argue that it was quite a big void because Grealish was so influential in terms of Aston Villa's attack, and they really struggled, I think, as soon as he got injured. The results weren't exactly on par with what they were like with Grealish back in. But now you have, the championship player of the season last year, someone who had 15 goals, 15 assists, and I think he just has a knock potentially for game week 1, but moving on from that, they have two nice fixtures still, game week 2 and game week 3. But I think one of the issues with Aston Villa right now is you might not want to double up on Aston Villa players. One of the issues is that if you're going for someone like Ings to start the season, you don't necessarily want to lock in 2 transfers immediately to kind of move away from both these players if Aston Villa don't get to a hot start, right? And you don't see them potentially being able to score versus some of the top sides. So that's my opinion on that. And that's why he's only kind of just at a good choice right now, especially due to the rotation concern. The differentials here are going to be Saka and Trossard. I think Saka is obviously coming off quite an intense Euros kind of run, and I think Arsenal don't have the best fixture. So I think at this point, bar the kind of nice little game versus Brentford, I don't really see huge potential for Saka to really effectuate within the first few weeks. So he's only a differential for me. And then with Trossard, I think he kind of benefits from the Welbeck injury. He might be able to be pushed a little bit higher up front, and he's definitely a player who I think is quite tidy, definitely passes the eye test, but you don't see him as a exceptional player. He kind of fits that kind of Brighton model where they perform very well, are able to kind of create nice plays, but ultimately underperform a little bit. And I think that's the kind of range that we're looking at for Trossard. He becomes that kind of differential. It really comes down to the fact that Brighton have nice fixtures, and you might really want to play around with that. But I wouldn't necessarily mess around with too many differentials, so that's why I've kind of put him there. At the 7 to 7.5 range, at 7 we only are really talking about Barnes and Zaha. I think Barnes has nicer fixtures. He's also playing with the same manager as last year, someone who really prefers playing with him. Whereas Zaha is a talismanic player for Crystal Palace, and I'm sure he'll do well for Vieira. He did it well already in the preseason, but ultimately with a new manager coming in, Crystal Palace could really struggle, I think, to start the season. So that's my kind of concern there, and that's why I put Zaha as a differential. Whereas Barnes, I think, looked fantastic in the preseason, also looked fantastic in the Community Shield, attacking versus a Man City defense, and he really does look like that kind of second forward once again in this kind of one striker formation that Brendan Rodgers started off with. There is a risk, I think, that he might get rotated, let's say with Iheanacho to come in if let's say Leicester is needing some goals, or maybe if Rodgers wants to kind of rest him to make sure that he's actually fit and stays fit. So there's a slight risk there, but I think Barnes is still at a fantastic price. And when you actually look at his kind of returns last season, I mean, at a 7.0 price, he's fantastic. If he's able to kind of match that last season form, and I really do think just from watching him in the preseason that he can do that. The same can be really said with Gundogan, right? I think he's fallen off a lot of people's radars because people are more interested in looking at players like Mahrez to kind of space out their teams a little bit based on his preseason form, and then also looking at some of the kind of underlying factors with, let's say, kind of Jack Grealish coming in and things like that. But right now, we still know that Kevin De Bruyne is injured, Foden is injured, and they'll still need attacking output from this team. And one of the central functions of that is Gundogan. You know, he can effectuate things from set pieces. He can also effectuate things just in his ability to, you know, abuse his kind of really good deep lying runs, and his ability to actually sense, you know, when to actually run to the near post is going to make the difference. And I think Gundogan has rather nice fixtures, to be honest, bar the Spurs game, and could really attack with the same kind of ferociousness that he did in that kind of hot run that Man City had in the middle of last year. So for that reason, I've considered him as the best choice. The reason why Jota and Greenwood for me are only considered good choices right now is I think, first of all, with Jota, you have a player who probably is going to fall down in terms of priority as the third Liverpool player in the side, right? I would probably still prefer having Trent over Jota. And then on that basis, I would probably still rather have Tsimikas over Jota because of the budget flexibility. And I think that kind of diminishes Jota's strength right now. And for Greenwood, I would say, watching kind of Man United this season, they did, in my opinion, play with Greenwood, who can kind of play out of position at times. He always finds these kind of late runs as well as a striker, as he did when he attacked Everton in the preseason. But in terms of open play, I wasn't too enamored with him. I still think he's not going to be playing such a key kind of attacking role in the team. And it makes sense right now to stick with someone like Fernandes if you want to cover up that United spot, especially due to the fact that Cavani doesn't seem to be ready for game week 1, and Martial is kind of back into the team. And for that reason, I think Greenwood seems to be one of those players that people think theoretically is a great option, but I think on the pitch, I'm not sure if he's really going to be able to do as much damage as people think. So I'm only going to put him as a good choice right now. I still prefer Barnes and Gundogan at that kind of price range. And Pepe is that kind of outlier there, where he had a fantastic end of the season, but it goes down to the fact that, you know, can Arsenal really attack well, to be honest, especially, you know, they struggled, I would say, versus the mid-table sides last year in terms of actually being able to create kind of large scoring margins and kind of secure victories, even though the defense was rather strong. And, you know, part of the problem was, I think, maybe Arteta not finding the right structure, but he did seem to find that at the end of the season when he was starting to play Pepe on that right mid spot. I think for me, the issue is, once again, can Arsenal score enough goals, and will Pepe be able to effectuate the game that much? I can see him doing well versus Brentford, but then with the tough fixtures, he becomes a bit more of a differential for me. When we kind of move up to the kind of just below the premium, the full premiums, we're looking at, I mean, Son, who, to be honest, is a premium, and then Mahrez and Havertz and Sancho. I think Son, as we know, is just that kind of talismanic player for Spurs. Even when Harry Kane is out, he's a fantastic player, and he probably benefits more on a goal-scoring front, you know, on that basis. Perhaps he might get a few less assists because there aren't such clinical finishers in the rest of the team. But for example, if you looked at the preseason friendly versus Arsenal, he really could have got an assist there if Dele Alli was able to find the net. And Son, to be honest, is still amazing at running off the shoulder defenders, amazing even sometimes playing with his back to goal. Not something he's very well versed at, but he could also still get you options in terms of scoring through just corners, right? He takes corners as well. So for me, he's the complete player, and at a 10 price, like, he's fantastic. That's all I have to really say. Mahrez and Havertz are a bit more interesting for me. I don't think they have the best fixtures, to be honest. But Mahrez is more someone who has nicer fixtures, but is a little bit affected by the odd Pep rotation, right? I think with Foden out, you know, Mahrez probably has much more chances to start and probably stay nailed for the early parts of the season. But I think it's whether you really want to kind of toss up and go into someone like Son, who's pretty close to him in price, or whether you want to just go for someone who is a little bit more nailed and could give you budget flexibility. And I think that's kind of the odd range that Mahrez is in this year, where he's a little bit pricey, just based on the fact that there might be nicer options for teams who are nailed on. But ultimately, you know, he is probably one of the best preseason performers that we've seen so far. And even when you actually look at his kind of points per match ratio last year, I think he was fantastic. So it still makes sense to go for Mahrez in my opinion. But it's kind of whether you're the type of person who wants to play with Pep Roulette. And I personally don't, but that's why I've kind of rated him as a good choice. Havertz is a nice fixture at the start, but then with Lukaku coming in, I mean, things could really change. His role could be a bit more diminished in terms of just pure goal scoring. I can see him getting a few more assists this season, but that's the issue, right? Will the team be mostly centered around Lukaku being the focal point? That seems to be the kind of player that, you know, Tuchel really wants to play around. And there might be some growing pains there, right? As Havertz once again has to readjust his role. So we'll see what happens there. But I think he's an interesting option. Some people have been also toying up with Havertz for game week 1 and then kind of having the cash to move into Mahrez or Son. That's potentially an interesting option, but I don't know if you really want to start the season with the transfer already and planned for game week 1. So that's just my question mark for Havertz. With Sancho, I think the issue is whether he's actually fit to start the season, and how Man United will play with him, right? We know he's a fantastic player, but there still is going to be a bit of an acclimation phase when a player joins a team and also kind of moves into a new league. So it's more about, having the capacity to move into Sancho. Let's say if you have someone like Son in your team, you have that capacity. So it's about looking into, I think, more kind of tried and tested options, and then maybe seeing, okay, if Sancho's doing well, I can move into him. So I wouldn't really necessarily start the season with him. It's a bit of an odd risk to take, in my opinion, especially since he might not be ready for game week 1. With the premiums, I think it's pretty simple, pretty standard. Salah and Bruno are probably going to be on most of managers' lists and most of their teams. Fantastic kind of captaincy options to start the few first game weeks. Kind of interesting with Bruno playing versus a Wolves side. I think people are worried about kind of Wolves in their defense, but with a more attacking manager, I think Bruno has good game weeks 3 and 4 as captaincy options, and I think he plays off quite well with Salah in that sense. And with Mane, of course, it's more about, if you don't want to go for Salah, having a look at Mane, and that's a huge risk to take, to be honest, but it could really pay off. People have been kind of alluding to the fact that Salah hasn't had a great preseason, and that's a fair point. Mane has had a great season in contrast, but when it comes down to Premier League statistics, their records in the last few years, I mean, Salah is clear. And for me, I wouldn't really take that risk as a manager to start game week 1. If we move on to the forwards now, this is where I think the reason why I haven't priced any of the 4.5 players is, simply put, I mean, there are no 4.5 options. You're pretty much putting them there because of budget reasons. They're not going to sniff the field, to be honest. They're probably going to be loaned out. This is really if you want to play a 3-5-2, right, to go for 4.5 forwards. I'm not really going to make any mention of them. I don't think there's any interesting options there. At the 6 to 6.5 range, the player that I've left out right now, who I think has just joined Southampton, is actually Armstrong. And for me, I think he's a player where, once again, he'll be a bit of a differential. We'll have to kind of wait and see how Southampton play with him. It might take a bit of time for him to adapt. He might not even be ready for game week 1. So I think he's a player to look out for, who I haven't necessarily included in this list now. But then I think the interesting options are, of course, Pukki and Mopé. Mopé, who we know, I think is just a common trap, to be honest. I've put him as a differential there. If you really do think that with the nice fixtures that Brighton he could maybe attack those fixtures rather well, and you can kind of move him to someone else. But really, to start the season off, I think the interesting thing is just looking into Tony, right? A lot of people who have 3-4-3 formations will probably have Tony in their team. If you're going for a 3-5-2, you might not have him. You might probably have gone for 2 slightly better premium forwards who are more tested. But Tony is that kind of talismanic option for Brentford, right? Who had a fantastic season in the Championship last year, kind of record-setting numbers, and seems to be the player who has the confidence that you need to play at a top level of football. And I mean, whilst I don't think this is an emotional game, ultimately, I think even if you project Brentford to have a terrible season, he is so key and part and parcel to the attacks, where I still see good kind of attacking contributions for him, even if Brentford's results are rather poor. And for that reason, I think Tony is that kind of punt that's worth taking. At this point in time, I don't really have him in my draft, but I still think he's a fantastic option if you think that the 3-4-3 kind of team is a bit more flexible, especially since the 4.5 midfielders are going to be nailed on, right, and actually going to be playing football. Rodrigo is a good side grade. Pukki as well. Pukki is a differential because in the first 4 weeks, I mean, they have terrible fixtures. Once you kind of get out of that, maybe he's a kind of get out of jail option with Tony. Same thing with Armstrong. So that's why I kind of have him as a differential right now. But Rodrigo is a pure kind of 6.5 side grade who seems to be nailed right now, playing as a 10 for Leeds. One of the issues there, of course, is that means that he's not necessarily going to be replacing Bamford potentially, right? That could mean that he's playing further back and potentially has much less chances. His expected goal statistics were fantastic, but that was mostly because he was playing in that striker position at times last season for Leeds. And if that's not going to be the case, if he's starting to play at an attacking mid position, maybe he's not worth it as a 6.5 forward. If we move on, though, we have the kind of 7 to 7.5 range of strikers. And I think at 7, you're really only talking about someone like Wood. He's a player who's, of course, for the last few years has done, I think, quietly very good, to be honest, for Burnley. And one of my only concerns is I think the fact that he played in the Olympics, he might be a bit leggy. And I think we've seen a gradual kind of decline in his performance in the last few years, and that's kind of my chief worry with Wood. And especially since that they're much nicer, much more solid options playing for much more attacking teams at 7.5. I think it's much more interesting to go into them. And I think for me, the best choice would be Antonio at that 7.5 range. He's nailed on to start. He's not injured right now, which is all we really care about. The same goes for Wilson, to be honest. These are both talismanic players for their teams. And I think with Wilson, what you have, the reason why I rate him at just a bit lower than Antonio is just, West Ham are a much more complete side in terms of getting goals and attacking for goals. So Antonio can even get his hand in assists even though he's not scoring. And Wilson, it's more about, whether Newcastle are able to kind of explode on, one week or another. And one of the issues with Wilson is that, he might not necessarily be kind of like pegging you points each week. And if you're playing around with him, you could find yourself easily transferring him out if he doesn't deliver on game week 1. And that's kind of the worry with Newcastle at times. They aren't exactly the most prolific kind of goal scoring team. With Iheanacho, I think the reason why I've only put him as a good choice, even though he had such a great back half of the season, is just due to the fact that based off the Community Shield, it seems like Rodgers might be returning to that kind of one striker formation. And now with Daka coming in with, there's just much more scope for rotation, right? He could be kind of playing a rotation role for Barnes when Rodgers might need to change formation. And if, let's say, the Leicester team are able to kind of get it done with Barnes in the team and with Vardy in, then he might only be playing 20-30 minutes a game. And that's a huge risk, of course, for a 7.5 player who you could really go for some players who will likely be playing 90 minutes. And that's my opinion on that. With Jimenez and Watkins, I've kind of mentioned them there because Jimenez is a fantastic option at game week 4 after the kind of initial tough fixtures for Wolves. And he becomes a great side grade for the two players at the top. With Watkins, his role is going to inevitably change because of Ings coming in. And I think with him also kind of maybe being substituted off in the recent friendly, he could have a knock. I'm not exactly sure what his role will concretely be. He was playing a striker role, to be honest, playing in a pair versus Ings. So he could still be a great option in game week 1, but I think you will kind of want to wait and see with Aston Villa, in my opinion, with that whether his position will change, especially when Buendia comes back in. With Ings, I think he becomes a top option, especially just due to how nice those fixtures are for the first 3 weeks. He is a proven striker, and I think even if he's coming into a new team and there might be growing pains there, he's still going to be able to find his way to score goals. And that's what we saw, to be honest, in his Southampton career. Even when the team wasn't performing very well, he was able to kind of find goals really out of nowhere. And even though he might drop deep at times, he is still able to effectuate the game. And I think Aston Villa is, no doubt a much better side right now, just in terms of the complete squad, especially with James Ward-Prowse being out for Aston Villa with an injury, that I think Ings is a pretty good punt for those first 3 fixtures to kind of attack the game weeks. With Bamford and DCL, these are once again proven players who had fantastic seasons last year. Bamford having the best season out of all these strikers, to be honest. And if you're the type of player who is high on Leeds and believe they can reproduce the performance, then I don't see any reason for you to not start the first game week with Bamford. Simply put, he will always get chances, even if Leeds are getting outscored, even if Leeds are kind of getting hammered. And that's the kind of beauty of having some of the Leeds attacking options, right? So that's my personal opinion on that. Dominic Calvert-Lewin, it seems he has some sort of toe injury, so that's a big question mark, but they have nice fixtures. So I think moving on, maybe game week 2 onwards, if Everton seem to play well versus Southampton, he could be someone that you can kind of set your eyes on. With Martial, much more of a risk, rotation prone for sure, because Cavani could come back by game week 2. And simply put, we didn't have much to watch last season from him. He was injured at times, and also it just seemed like he was set for a poor season when you were watching him in the early matches, especially with his kind of big mistake in the Tottenham match. And I think it's not really worth kind of putting your eggs in the Martial basket this year. With the 8.5 to 10.5 options, it's once again just risky, right? Cavani doesn't seem to be ready for game week 1, so I would almost cross him out because I think he's actually back to Uruguay visiting his family. With Vardy, of course, it's a question of whether you think that there's potential for Leicester to attack those early fixtures and for him to kind of pop off. Ultimately, he's going to be the starting striker no matter what. I think he's still trusted by Rodgers to kind of do the job there. And if you think Leicester can kind of blow some of the teams out of the water early before he kind of gets subbed off, then that's why you would pick Vardy. But still, maybe unless you're kind of looking for Vardy to kind of switch straight into Lukaku, I don't necessarily see the option to start with Vardy when there are probably arguably better options with lower prices, right? When we go higher than that, I'm projecting Lukaku to be slightly above 10.5, maybe below 12, definitely below 12.5, you know, but between Vardy and Kane, really. And I mean, I think for me, Lukaku is a top player. He's definitely improved many levels since joining Serie A and playing under Conte, and he's improved tremendously as a player. I think he'll definitely fit well in Tuchel's system, and Tuchel seems to be very excited into playing with Lukaku. And what I would say about Tuchel is he's a player that definitely envisions a specific style of play, and when he goes for a player, you know that that player usually will have a key role in that team, and I don't expect that to be different with Lukaku. The only tough thing for Chelsea, of course, is they have tough fixtures, and it's better to kind of go with other premiums to start the season that have nicer fixtures, and that's just simply the way it comes down, right? Post game week 7, though, of course, Chelsea has fantastic fixtures, and that's probably where you want to kind of make sure that your team has a plan in place to kind of find Lukaku in your side. With Kane, once again, he becomes a rotation option. I think he just came back from Miami on holiday at 12.5, and you know he probably isn't going to be ready for game week 1. It's still a tough fixture versus City. Arguably, if you actually look at the statistics historically, Son is someone who's scored many more goals versus City than Kane has. City has historically struggled with runs in behind, and I think there's a potential for Son to attack. And with Kane, I think it's more about kind of seeing what the situation pans out with him, whether he transfers to Man City, because that would kind of make him a lot more interesting as an option. And if he stays with Tottenham, I think you're probably safe to kind of not start the season without him. And that's pretty much how I view the team selection process. Let me know how you guys think. This is an extremely long video, but I hope it helps you out. It's kind of just my complete rundown of all the interesting players this season for fantasy.